Hi, this is E. David Crawford, Editor-in-Chief of Grand Rounds in Urology. Joining me is Dr. Evan Goldfischer. Evan is the Secretary of LUGPA and the founding premier medical research group member. And he has been on Grand Rounds in Urology a number of times in the last month with some very outstanding presentations. He's going to share with us his feelings about managing a clinical research program in 2020. And believe me, there's a lot of challenges that exist. Evan, thanks a lot and look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, David, for that very nice introduction, and welcome to this edition of Grand Rounds in Urology. Over the next 5 to 10 minutes, we're going to talk about managing a clinical research program in 2020. I am a certified principal investigator. That's what those initials there on the title slide stand for, CPI. And I've been a principal investigator for over 400 clinical trials in pretty much every area of urology. Our agenda today is we're going to talk about why do you want to do clinical research in 2020, what's different about it in 2020, how to obtain trials, how to structure your research department, and then most importantly, to have a successful research department, you really have to obtain physician engagement. So why do clinical research? In short, we've got great treatments for a lot of our diseases like prostate cancer, bladder cancer, BPH, ED, stress urinary incontinence, but there's always something new coming out. All of us went into urology because we love the field and we love the fact that they're continuing to have new advances all the time. When you're doing clinical research, you're truly on the cutting edge. You're doing and testing products and drugs before they're out on the market, before your colleagues know about them, sometimes even before the big academic medical centers know about them. So you're really, really, really cutting edge, and it really keeps your day interesting. It can be, and I say it can be, an additional source of revenue for the practice, not always, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And when these drugs come out and these devices come out, you're the one who's had clinical experience with them rather than your colleagues. You are the key opinion leader. And with this experience, you're the first ones typically to try them on your patients and see how they respond in an approved environment. It's also, I find clinical research very enjoyable. Again, it breaks up the day. It's something very different. So what's different in 2020? I've been doing this for 22 years right now, and 22 years ago, it really was the wild, wild, wild west. You wanted to be a clinical researcher, you said you were a clinical researcher, and off you go, you had clinical research trials. Not anymore. Now you actually have to go through formal training. You definitely have to have good clinical practice training, which can be done online before you're going to do any trials. Most companies now want the principal investigator to be a certified principal investigator. That's 2,000 hours of doing clinical research and going to one of those testing centers and taking a clinical exam and passing it. There is a lot more paperwork right now than there was 21 years ago. There are a lot more FDA audits than there ever have been, so you really have to dot your I's and cross your T's and pay close attention to all the results and adverse events that come across your fax or email every day. It's not like the olden days when we were doing a lot of erectile dysfunction and overactive bladder trials, and you would get very high enrolling studies of drugs like Viagra, Levitra, and Cialis. Now we're doing a lot more cancer trials, and the cancer trials are much more difficult to enroll in. It's going to require more of your time. And your practice has to figure out how to give you that time, how to compensate you for the time that you're spending, because it will take away from some of the clinical productivity. You're also going to have to figure out how to compensate your coordinators. Research is a lot more complicated right now. You have to have really, really, really good clinical research coordinators. At least one of them on your team has to be a nurse, because you will be starting IV and administering drugs. And good clinical coordinators can be very, very, very hard to find. And if you are just starting with an RN who's never done clinical research, it really is about a full year to get them completely trained and up and running and doing it. What else is different in 2020? There used to be investigator meetings where you would fly someplace in the country and you'd get together with all the other investigators and the sponsor, and you'd really sit down, look at the protocol in detail, give your feedback, and there was a lot of give and take. Those investigator meetings rarely happen now. Typically, you're getting a protocol, and it's to be viewed as a recipe book. Follow the protocol. Don't deviate from the protocol. That's how you get an FDA audit. The inclusion and exclusion criteria are sometimes very, very, very difficult, particularly with the cancer trial that may require a specific genetic mutation. You have to have physician engagement in your practice, and for the practices that are on some sort of eat what you kill or partial eat what you kill compensation model, everybody's focused on getting RVUs, and enrolling a patient in a clinical trial definitely takes more time. It takes away from productivity. We don't have as many paper diaries now, or questionnaires, or case report forms. In fact, they're rare. Typically now we see mostly everything being done electronically. And then finally, you have to negotiate good budgets. Most practices are not going to let you do clinical research if you're going to lose money. You've got to at least break even, hopefully make some money. So you've got to actually know what your costs are to draw blood, to process samples, to do a history and physical, to administer drugs, to store the drugs. So developing a really, really, really robust budget is extremely important. So you've got to obtain clinical trials. By far and away, the most important and most efficient way to get clinical trials is networking. After you've done a number of trials, you'll get known in the industry, and sponsors will call you. You'll also hopefully have developed a network of other people that are doing clinical trials, other sites, and your coordinators or the investigators can talk and find out what everybody's doing and share leads. You can also go to clinicaltrials.gov, nih.gov, WCG, clinical.gov to find clinical trials. And you're going to want to maintain really good patient databases. You want to know what patients you have who are anxious to participate in clinical trial, people who have done clinical trials and been very meticulous in filling out their diaries and compliant with their medications. And it'll also help you know which trials you should say yes to and which trials you should say no to. Particularly now that there's so many cancer trials, you really want to integrate with your prostate cancer or your bladder cancer or your renal cancer clinic. It's important for your research coordinators and the APPs in those clinics, or the coordinators in those clinics, to work together. Otherwise, you won't get the volume that you need. The coordinators in the clinics can really feed the research coordinators, the patients who have failed a lot of the conventional therapies that are out there. I typically recommend that you have one research coordinator running 4 trials at a time, not 4 trials that are in active enrollment, but maybe 1 trial that's just ramping up, 2 trials that are in active enrollment, and 1 trial that's close to enrollment and you're just doing follow-up visits. Someone in your department, usually the PI, but maybe someone in your finance department, your practice, has to know how to negotiate the budgets and has to understand the costs involved. Obviously, there has to be some sort of compensation for the principal investigators and or the director. Sometimes they're the same people. There is a cost for doctors to take time out of their practice to refer the patients, so they need to be compensated in some way for taking time to refer patients to clinical trials. And understand there is some payoff at the very end, as the principal investigators are usually invited to be KOLs, participate in ad boards, and be speakers for the product, device, or the new product, new drug. So again, I can't emphasize this enough. Make sure you understand your costs, make sure you understand your margin, understand what your profit's going to be. You can't just do clinical research for pure doing clinical research, or your practice will shut you down. You can't lose money on it. You've got to at least break even. Previous experience doing clinical trials and negotiating budgets is helpful. It's okay to say no to a trial. Look at your databases and see if you can actually fill the trials with the inclusion and exclusion criteria that the sponsors want. I will tell you that I turn down far more trials than I accept. And as a result, we have a pretty good reputation in the industry, because if we say no, then the sponsor will often go back and say, wow, we created a trial that no one can actually enroll in. And usually if we get a trial and we say yes to it, we usually fulfill our quota, and the sponsors are happy, and they'll usually come back to us for more trials. Again, databases, very, very, very important. When you look at trials, make sure whatever electronic device they have to capture the data is easy to operate for your patients, particularly your elderly patients. Figure out what works in your market. Is it advertising on the radio? Is it advertising in print? Or is it digital media that works for you? Make sure you have signs in your waiting rooms that are, of course, approved by your research board that can alert patients. Perhaps they'll start the conversation and they'll ask you about doing clinical trials, and let your referring doctors know that you're clinical trials. They may not necessarily refer you patients, but they'll view you in a different light, that you're cutting edge and you're really trying to look at new therapies and new treatments for their patients. Clinical research is not just the PI or the director doing a trial. It absolutely involves everybody in the practice. Everybody needs to participate, particularly all of your partners. Again, the PI needs to be compensated for their time and their efforts. Be selective in the trials that you take. Make sure you can actually enroll, because if a sponsor gives you a number of trials and you fail multiple times to enroll their quota that you have promised them, then they won't come back to you anymore. And finally, budget negotiation is more and more difficult, but you have to be very careful not to take a trial that you're going to lose money. Make sure that you negotiate to at least cover your costs, if not make a profit. Thank you all for your time today. Appreciate everybody listening, and look forward to see you on our next talk in Grand Rounds in Urology.